Sup, it's your boy John Locke. Today I'm revisiting something we have spoken about many times before, and is a point that is in no way novel, but it's nonetheless one that fails to be understood, at least I think, by many people who consider themselves to be anti-liberal in some way. They could be conservatives, libertarians, people on the alt-right, but rather, they are simply an older generation or reiteration of the same thing they are actually arguing against. In fact, I would argue they are a function of what they are arguing against, and without this awareness of where they sit politically, they will fail time and time again. So when we look to classical liberals, the OGs of liberalism, John Locke, Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, Immanuel Kant, etc., what unites these liberals with the liberals of today, whether that be John Rawls, his philosophical rival Robert Nozick, or even the non-philosopher leftist of today who chants Black Lives Matter and sees the future as female and so on. So let's discuss some of the central tenets of liberalism before walking back to the original principles governing all of it. So the focal point for the classical liberals was the rightful use of power, and as a result of which, humans are considered to have rights that those with power cannot infringe on. This is to say, liberalism is concerned with putting demands to the center. This is the nature of rights and rights speak. Rights are a purely mental entity that is distributed by the center as if it were a good or service. However, liberals such as John Locke would argue that rights such as the right to life, liberty, and property have a foundation independent of the laws of any particular society. That is to say, it is the liberal contention that these mental entities, these abstractions, come before society, the social order, sociality, human organization, and etc. In a sentence, abstraction precedes sociality. This is liberalism. Men are naturally free and are naturally not subject to power, and then institutions of power are resurrected by the will of the people governed by them. Society is secondary to and is resurrected by the mental entities of free individuals, and this resurrection is achieved via means of contract, or the social contract. So the only type of legitimate power is that which is contracted to. So, under liberalism, there is a pre-societal individual. The starting principle is a man that exists outside of his societal context and then enters into society, which is to suggest there were men who lived without center or margin. This is the state of nature. Man is naturally antisocial and becomes social through his own self-interest via contract, and thus the state is reduced to an exchange. This is liberalism. Now, what stems from this is that the center is the unconscious entity that the margin draws from and puts demands to, while the center can make no such demands of the margin. There is a will of the people, but there is no will of the sovereign, or will of the church, or will of the center. There is an asymmetry between the two, and the margin is privileged above the center. Some of these rights, these mental entities, are given to the state. For instance, I have no right to tax and to wage war, but the state does. But this delegation is only insofar as it can better fulfill the demand of life, liberty, and property. If these demands are not being met, then the citizenry is justified in gathering together and taking up arms against their sovereign. And naturally, to create this asymmetry, civil power must be separated into the legislative and the executive. Power is made unconscious and informal. The common theme here is that it is immoral for anyone to rule, for anyone to have true power in the formal sense. Instead, power must be separated and divided and fragmented, such that the abstract concepts and mental entities are what rule, that is, the rule of law. So, now let us work backwards through what we have just laid out, and the points of juncture with recent political failings will become clear. So, starting with what we had just said, the rule of law, the rule of abstractions, the idea that there can be no one above the law. Robert Filmer spoke of the only form of government being monarchy. Filmer's point is that there will always be someone that is an exception to the rules others are held to, like a monarch. And so all non-authoritarian governments like democracy are just confused monarchies. And the absolutist view is that ideological monarchism may be thrown in the dustbin of history, but ontological monarchism is true for all times. Behind the illusion of revolution and democratic procedure, there is an exception to the rule of law who monarchically governs things. This view isn't particularly concerned with reviving some larpy medieval monarchy with the same aesthetic and attitude and atmosphere, but formalizing power as to avoid high-low versus middle, the destructive pincer of liberalism that at this rate will have everything we have built buried in an unmarked grave in less than a century. So if there be a government, it is monarchism. The only question is the degree of sovereign turnover and the degree to which that monarch's power is formalized. This isn't to say that monarchy is the only just form of government. Absolutists are outside the view of politics as a discourse between these competing claimants over rights and justice and moral imperatives that become more and more obscure with each generation, from the classical liberals and their demands against the sovereign to modern liberals and their equivalent demands against the institutions set up by the latter. Instead, the absolutists see the center as something with its own imperatives, its own demands, and these demands are embedded in all aspects of society. And without one's self-donation and obedience towards these imperatives, you become a potential victim of all sorts of tyranny and genocide, formally or informally. So maybe the rule of law instead is the rule of men, insofar as those men's rule is inherited from the will of the people. This is at least tangible, or more tangible, and it's not a rule of mental entities without bodies. However, all authority is derived from previous authorities. Every act of revolution is really the expansion of one institution against another. In the liberal revolution, it was Parliament against the king. Today, it's the institutions of soft power, a coalition of left-wing political leaders, global financial institutions, and the media against the institutions of hard power and right-wing political leaders, and their strategy thus far has been to remove the base, the white middle class. It is a revolution of the neoliberal order against the old liberal order. So it is impossible for authority to be derived from a non-authority such as the will of the people. You can envision an image of thought where power centers do everything they can to expand, and so the vacuum required for authority to come from non-authority seldom presents itself. And likewise to revolutions, the biggest acts of tyranny have typically been the final blow of one power center against another. Typically, governments have a social ideal, some idea of the good that they invoke to further their own power, and they may do horrible things in pursuit of it, but it is the result of unsecure power that makes this necessary. The biggest culprits of what we would call tyranny have been states within states, imperium in imperio, deep states, not those that are absolute and have their power unfractured and in clear sight. But more specifically, this centerless, marginless vacuum that man finds himself in until deciding society is more advantageous, this imaginary state of nature, Minecraft as a historical game. Well, what are we to make of this? Well, firstly, a humanity without a center is impossible. Humanity is incarnated by joint attention. Human desires are subject to and mediated by the desires of others. René Girard had called this triangular desire, and it occurs pre-rationally and subconsciously, so humanity has collective intentions. The social group we exist in converges itself upon things, and in some instances, that thing that all attendees in the group desire is held in place and becomes the center. This process we have already described elsewhere. This is the birth of humanity as the language-speaking animal. And I'll put the further videos on this subject in the description. In early man, it constitutes a sacral object, but eventually, men would come to occupy that space and become god-emperors, and this scenic event generates itself in all cultural and political happenings, no matter how obscured and hidden it is. And so, no social contract can exist in such a scenario because the linguistic capacity to negotiate it is yet to exist. The center is the first linguistic act, and it communicates the injunction against its own appropriation. This is all to say, there is no pre-societal individual that exists without center or margin, as we have discussed. Humans come into being as worshippers who, of course, are worshippers around a center. So, if we look at, say, Charlottesville, one of the biggest political failures this decade, by which young men were doxxed, lost their livelihood, were harassed even to the point that one man tragically took his own life, all without any sympathy from even most of the right wing. If we compare this to a Black Lives Matter rally, where unlike at Charlottesville, the calls to violence are explicit, chanting that they want dead cops, culminating in Mika Xavier Johnson killing 5 officers and wounding 9 others in addition to 2 civilians, which, unlike, say, James Fields, the respective political groups weren't given any responsibility whatsoever. Even just recently, how is it that a group of, say, white Catholic teenagers are depersonalized and made the Antichrist by the media for just standing there and smirking, despite the only people present at the scene to make any type of racial slurs were a group of fully grown black men? Seeing all this, it becomes increasingly less viable to mimic the political strategy of leftists, this idea of grassroots activism, by which if you are just loud enough, they will hand you the keys, that defeating political elites is just a matter of winning a popularity contest, as if revolutionary voices destroyed whole institutions just by being loud and hip and by having good PR. All of this rests on the assumption that institutions are just noise sitting on top of the sea of spontaneous individuals, that institutions come second to the individual, that is, liberal ontology, when really, the left had institutional security far before they were out in the streets doing their robust and colourful protests, and trying to imitate those protests without your Soros money or the global financial system behind you. That won't turn out well for you, and likewise, neither will ignoring liberal ontology because it's too removed from your interests or because it's just big brain nibber stuff. But alas, perhaps acknowledging alternatives to liberalism is pushing the envelope. After all, it is far more cozy to continue the American vision of liberal republicanism, at least for the meantime. But anyway guys, that's gonna have to do it for this video. If you like this video, make sure to check out all my social media, all that good stuff. If you really liked it, feel free to hit up my Patreon. I'd like to give a thanks to some of you who donated via PayPal. That really means a lot to me and that really helps out. And I know who all of you are, of course. Somebody suggested to me that I set up a Bitcoin just to preserve the anonymity of the people that wanted to donate, or set up cryptocurrency more generally. And I'll definitely get around to that, but thanks guys, I definitely appreciate the donation. And so I'll catch you guys later.